Lake Herman Road runs east out of Benicia, California, through a landscape of low hills and dry grass that in December holds its color somewhere between gold and gray. The road is not particularly long. It connects a small city to the open land beyond it, and along certain stretches there are no lights, no houses, and very little reason for anyone passing through to slow down or stop. On the night of December 20th, 1968, two people were parked there in the dark, and by the time another driver came along the road and saw what had happened, the case that would eventually be documented under the name of the Zodiac Killer had already begun. That was the first sight. There would be others. Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo sits a short distance from the center of a city that in the summer of 1969 was an ordinary Bay Area community of working families and naval personnel. The park has a picnic area and a parking lot, and on the night of July 4th, 1969, the lot was in use as it would be on a holiday evening. The attack there followed a pattern investigators would later compare with the December incident on Lake Herman Road. A car, a remote-feeling location, darkness, and a phone call placed afterward to the local police. The caller gave directions and described what he had done. That call was recorded, and the recording has been held in evidence in the decades since. The shore of Lake Berryessa in Napa County looks different from the Vallejo Park, and different again from the road outside Benicia. The reservoir is wide and set among dry hills, and on the afternoon of September 27th, 1969, the area around a particular picnic site was occupied by people who had come out for a quiet day near the water. The attack at Lake Berryessa occurred in daylight, which distinguished it from the earlier incidents, and it involved a method that differed in character from the shootings. A wooden fence post near the site was later found to bear writing attributed to the attacker. Napa County held jurisdiction over that location. The fourth confirmed attack site was in the middle of a residential neighborhood in San Francisco. The intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets in Presidio Heights is tree-lined and quiet, the kind of block where houses sit close to the pavement and the streetlights give off a warm, even glow on clear nights. On the evening of October 11th, 1969, a yellow taxicab was parked at that curb. The driver was Paul Stein. He was 29 years old, a graduate student at San Francisco State, and he had been working the cab to support himself. What happened at that intersection on that night fell under the jurisdiction of the San Francisco Police Department, which placed it in a different county and a different administrative system from the three sites that came before it. 4 locations, 4 separate jurisdictions, miles of Northern California landscape between them, the flat marshland near Benicia, the suburban parks of Vallejo, the dry hills of Napa, the residential grid of San Francisco's western neighborhoods, each one a distinct place, each one generating its own reports, its own evidence collection, its own chain of custody, its own assigned investigators operating within the structures of a specific county or city department. The geography of the Zodiac case is not incidental to its history. It is in many respects central to it. Law enforcement and most criminologists working with the available record have attributed a confirmed minimum of 5 murders and 2 non-fatal attacks to the Zodiac Killer, occurring across those sites and that timeline between December 1968 and October 1969. The word confirmed is doing specific work in that sentence. It refers to the attacks that multiple agencies, forensic reviewers, and investigative analysts have assessed against the available evidence and determined to fall within a coherent series connected by method, by the letter correspondence that followed them, and by other details documented in the original case files. The confirmed number has remained stable in the professional literature. The writer who took credit for these attacks claimed a considerably higher count in his letters, but those claims were never substantiated by independent investigation. Beginning in August 1969, an individual claiming responsibility for the murders began sending letters to Bay Area newspapers. The letters went simultaneously to 3 publications: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. The selection of 3 separate recipients, sent at the same time, was deliberate in its construction. A letter arriving at one paper could be doubted or suppressed, but 3 arriving together, each containing a portion of an enciphered message that only made sense when the 3 portions were assembled, made suppression impractical. The Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Times-Herald each published their letters, and the public response was immediate. The letters themselves were handwritten, and the writer used a particular style of block printing that would become familiar to investigators and document examiners over the months and years that followed. The August 1969 letters contained sections of cipher, a substitution code using symbols in place of letters, and the writer demanded that the newspapers publish these ciphers on their front pages. The first cipher, assembled from the 3 portions sent to the 3 papers, was eventually decoded by a married couple in Salinas, Donald and Betty Hardin, who worked through the substitution pattern over a weekend and submitted their solution to investigators. The decoded text did not contain the writer's name, which he had indicated it would. What it contained instead was a statement of belief about killing and what the writer claimed it offered him. The letter, dated August 7, 1969, was the one in which the writer first used the name the Zodiac to refer to himself. That name had not appeared in the earlier letters. Its introduction in that specific letter is why August 7, 1969 is the documented date on which the identity the public would come to know was formally claimed by whoever was writing. Approximately 37 communications are considered potentially genuine by investigators, though the exact number of authentic letters has remained a matter of ongoing debate among analysts and within law enforcement. The writer continued to send correspondence long after the confirmed attacks had ended. Some of these later letters contained claims about additional victims. Some contained new ciphers. Some were cards or brief notes. Some arrived at newspaper offices, and some were sent directly to law enforcement. The range and character of the correspondence varied considerably over the years it continued, and the question of where to draw the line between genuine communications and imitation letters sent by others was never definitively resolved. Some communications accepted as genuine by one analyst were rejected by another. The debate about the boundaries of the authentic corpus is itself a documented part of the case's history. The body count the writer claimed in his letters exceeded the number of victims whose deaths investigators could attribute to him with confidence. The confirmed minimum is 5. The writer eventually claimed more than 30. That gap between what the letters said and what the investigations could verify is one of the structural features of the case that has persisted through every subsequent review. Whether the writer was inflating his count for effect, fabricating victims entirely, or referring to deaths that were never connected to him by investigators, is a question the record does not answer. The San Francisco Chronicle's main newsroom in 1969 occupied a building on 5th Street, and the envelope that arrived there in the first week of August came through the ordinary morning mail. It was addressed in block lettering and bore no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and a section of enciphered text. One portion of the 3-part cipher that could only be read in full when the other 2 portions, arriving that same morning at the Examiner and the Times-Herald, were placed beside it. The person at the Chronicle's front desk who sorted the morning mail that day had no particular reason to treat this envelope differently from the others until its contents made the reason apparent. There is something specific about the Chronicle's role in this case that the record makes clear. The newspaper received more Zodiac correspondence than any other single recipient. Over the period the letters continued, the Chronicle's desk became the primary destination for whatever the writer chose to send, and its editors made decisions about publication, about when to contact police, and about what to withhold from print that shaped how the case developed in public understanding. The working relationship between the paper's staff and the San Francisco Police Department during the late 1969 period in particular is documented in the investigative files in a way that gives a picture of two institutions trying to navigate the same unusual situation from different institutional positions. The case formally remains open, not as a rhetorical gesture or a way of acknowledging a long-standing mystery, but in the administrative sense as a documented status held in the records of the agencies that received it. Solano County, which holds jurisdiction over the Benicia and Vallejo locations, maintains an open file. Napa County, which covers the Lake Berryessa site, maintains an open file. The city and county of San Francisco maintains an open file for the Presidio Heights murder and the letter correspondence that addressed its police department directly. No single law enforcement agency has ever held sole investigative authority over the complete set of confirmed crimes. Each county administered its portion of the case independently, shared information with the others to varying degrees at various points in time, and has maintained its records within its own systems. That structural reality, multiple open files and multiple independent agencies, is one of the most straightforward things that can be said about why the case has never been officially resolved. It is not a dramatic explanation. It is an administrative one. Investigations that cross county lines require coordination that has to be built and maintained. And the coordination available to Northern California law enforcement in the late 1960s was not the same as the coordination available to investigators working decades later with different communication technologies and different interagency frameworks. The Zodiac case developed across exactly the kind of jurisdictional boundaries that such frameworks were designed years later to address. The letters sent by the Zodiac writer, the ciphers they contained, and the physical envelopes they were sealed inside have been preserved in the evidence holdings of the agencies that received them. Original letters are held by the San Francisco Police Department, which received the largest volume of correspondence. The physical objects, paper, ink, envelopes, stamps, sealed flaps, have been treated as evidence since they arrived, which means they have been handled, examined, and in some cases subjected to forensic testing over a period of more than 50 years. The sealed flaps of those envelopes became the subject of a specific kind of forensic attention that would not have been possible at the time the letters were sent. Whoever sealed those envelopes licked the adhesive and pressed it shut. That act left biological material, specifically cells from the mucous membranes of the mouth, deposited on the adhesive in trace quantities. In 1969, and for many years afterward, that material was not understood as the recoverable forensic resource it would later prove to be. The investigative tools available in 1969 could tell investigators relatively little about biological trace material of this kind. The tools that became available in subsequent decades could tell them considerably more. Forensic analysts working with Zodiac evidence in the years after DNA analysis became a standard investigative tool were able to extract material from the sealed flaps of some of the envelopes. The process of extraction is careful work. The material is present in small quantities. It can be affected by age and storage conditions, and not every envelope yielded usable material with equal clarity. From the material that was successfully extracted, analysts produced a partial male DNA profile. Partial means exactly what it sounds like, not a complete genetic profile of the kind that would allow definitive identification under forensic standards, but a profile that covers enough specific genetic markers to be meaningful for comparison purposes. The profile is male. It was produced from biological material left by whoever sealed those envelopes. That profile has been entered into state and federal criminal databases and run against the records they contain. It has been compared directly against DNA samples taken from named suspects in the course of the investigation. The results of those comparisons are documented in investigative records. No comparison has produced a confirmed match. The profile exists. The databases have been searched. The comparisons have been made. None of them has resolved into the confirmation that would move the case from open to closed. The partial profile is, in one sense, the closest thing the case possesses to a direct biological signature of the Zodiac writer. If the same person who killed the confirmed victims also sealed those envelopes, and that connection is assumed by investigators, though it is worth being precise that it is an inference supported by context rather than a separately confirmed fact, then the partial profile represents something extracted from the body of whoever the Zodiac Killer was. It is a fragment. It is real. It is held in a law enforcement database, associated with a case number that belongs to files that span multiple counties and more than 5 decades. The intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets in Presidio Heights still exists in the form it held in October 1969, the way urban residential blocks tend to persist across decades when the surrounding neighborhood is stable. The trees that line the street are older now. The pavement has been resurfaced. The houses are the same houses, inhabited by people who may or may not know the block's particular place in a documented criminal history. Paul Stein's cab sat at that curb on the night of October 11th, and investigators arrived to examine it in the hours afterward, working under portable artificial light brought to the scene because the natural light was gone and the work needed to be done carefully. The interior of the cab was a crime scene and an evidence source simultaneously, and the investigators who processed it were working at the intersection of two things: what had happened there, which was already over, and what might be learned from the surfaces and materials left behind, which still had to be carefully extracted and documented. What they found there, and what they were able to do with what they found, was determined in part by the forensic methods available at the time, and in part by the decisions made in the immediate aftermath about what to preserve and how. Some of the physical evidence from that cab became significant in the years that followed, in ways that the investigators processing the scene on the night of October 11th could not have fully anticipated. Evidence that is collected and carefully preserved retains its potential usefulness even as the methods for using it change and improve. Evidence that is lost, contaminated, or destroyed does not. The decisions made about preservation in the immediate aftermath of the Stein murder and at each of the other confirmed sites had consequences that extended across the decades the case has been running. The wooden fence post at Lake Berryessa, or more precisely, whatever the attacker wrote on it, represented a different kind of evidence. It was a surface, outdoors, exposed to weather and time. Its condition and subsequent examinations was affected by those factors in ways that interior surfaces are not. The writing found on it was documented and photographed, and what those photographs captured has been part of the Napa County investigative record since 1969, but a fence post in an outdoor environment is not an archive. The physical writing faded and changed over time in the way that outdoor surfaces do. The case's geographic spread created not just a jurisdictional situation, but a documentary one. Evidence was held in different places by different agencies under different administrative systems. A manila folder in a Napa County evidence room and a manila folder in a San Francisco Police Department filing cabinet might both contain material relevant to the same series of crimes, generated by investigators who were aware of each other's existence and were in periodic contact, but the two folders were not in the same room. They were not in the same system. The information in one did not automatically become available to the person examining the other. That fragmentation of the documentary record across multiple independent institutions is a feature of the case that has shaped every subsequent review that has tried to assemble a complete picture. The California Department of Justice maintained its own involvement in the case at the state level, offering forensic laboratory resources and analytical capacity that individual county departments did not always possess internally. Its files represent a further repository of Zodiac-related documentation maintained within a state system rather than a county or city one. Investigators from the affected jurisdictions interacted with the DOJ at various points, submitted evidence for analysis, and received findings that were incorporated into their own records. What the state held and what the individual counties held overlapped in some areas and complemented in others, and the relationship between those different documentary bodies is itself part of what a complete review of the case has to account for. The summer of 1969, which brought the beginning of the letter correspondence, also brought the August cipher, the three-part enciphered message distributed across the three newspapers simultaneously. The Hardens who solved it were not investigators. They were a schoolteacher and her husband who read about the cipher in the papers and applied themselves to the problem over a weekend. Their solution was submitted to investigators and their methodology was examined. The decoded text they produced is the accepted solution to the first cipher, though the process of decoding was not conducted under laboratory conditions with controlled methodology in the way that a formal forensic analysis would be. It was done at a kitchen table in Salinas by two people who found the problem interesting. The second cipher that the Zodiac writer sent, a shorter message of 32 characters, remained unsolved for more than 50 years before a team of amateur code breakers announced a solution in December 2020, working collaboratively across different time zones using computational tools unavailable to earlier solvers. Their proposed solution has been examined by other analysts and is generally considered credible, though it has not been formally certified by any law enforcement agency as a confirmed decode. The 51 years between the sending of that cipher and the proposed solution is a span of time that itself says something about the character of this case, the way it has persisted, unsettled, and still generating new attention, long past the period when active investigation was at its most intense. The third and fourth ciphers sent by the Zodiac writer have not been solved, and attempts to solve them continue. Some analysts believe the third cipher is a genuine substitution code with a recoverable solution. Others have suggested it may be a hoax with no meaningful underlying text. The record contains both positions, documented in analyses produced by researchers with different methodological approaches. Law enforcement has not publicly endorsed any proposed solution or any characterization of these ciphers as solvable or unsolvable. The writer referred to himself as the Zodiac for the first time on August 7th, 1969. He used astrological language in some of his letters and signed with a crosshair symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical and a horizontal line that became the most widely recognized visual signature of the case. The crosshair symbol appeared on envelopes at the end of letters, and according to the investigation, on the face of a particular brand of watch. The symbol itself was not invented by the writer. It appeared in the logo of the Zodiac Watch Company, a Swiss brand sold in the United States during that period.
The relationship between the symbol, the brand, and the name the writer chose for himself has been part of the investigative record since 1971 and will receive its proper treatment in the examination of the specific suspect to whom it became relevant. What can be said here, at this distance from the specific details of any named individual, is that the symbol and the name together formed the identity under which the letter writer made himself known.
And that identity persisted in the public record and the investigative files for decades after the confirmed attacks ended. The last letter widely accepted as genuine by investigators was sent in 1974. The confirmed attacks, as noted, ended in October 1969. The gap between those two dates, roughly 5 years, during which the writer apparently continued to correspond without committing further verified murders, is another of the structural features of the case that analysts have noted, and that the record documents without resolving. The confirmed timeline, from the December 1968 attack on Lake Herman Road to the October 1969 shooting at Washington and Cherry Streets, covers 10 months. 10 months during which the attacks moved across the Bay Area geography, from the outskirts of Benicia to the parks of Vallejo, to the shore of a Napa County reservoir, to a residential corner in San Francisco, in a pattern that drew the attention of investigators who were operating in different jurisdictions and trying to understand whether they were dealing with a single individual responsible for all of these incidents. The connection between the sites was established through the letter correspondence as much as through physical forensic comparison, because the writer himself claimed all of them and provided details in his letters that only someone present at the scenes or someone with access to investigative information not yet made public could have known. That evidentiary logic, connecting the sites through the letters and connecting the letters to the crimes through details that verified the writer's claimed presence, is the foundational structure of the confirmed case. It is also the structure that leaves the case dependent on the correspondence in ways that create complications. If the letter writer was the killer, then the correspondence is a direct and documented record of his actions and his identity claims. If the letter writer was not the killer, if someone else adopted the crimes and wrote letters claiming them, then the entire evidentiary structure shifts in character. Most investigators and analysts who have reviewed the case have concluded that the evidence strongly supports the letter writer and the killer being the same person. That conclusion is supported by the specific details in the letters. It has not been independently confirmed by physical forensic evidence linking the biological material on the envelopes to any of the crime scenes. Solano County, Napa County, the city and county of San Francisco, 3 separate administrative systems, 3 separate sets of files, 3 separate lines of investigative authority that have never been consolidated under a single prosecutorial jurisdiction. The Zodiac case has never had a lead agency in the way that some multi-jurisdictional investigations do, a designated coordinating body with authority over all the evidence and the responsibility for managing the complete investigative record. Each county has managed its portion. The state of California has provided forensic support. The interactions between the agencies have been documented, but the architecture of the case's administration has remained fragmented in a way that reflects the structure of California's law enforcement system and the period in which the crimes occurred. There is no photograph that shows the Zodiac Killer. There is no recording that has been confirmed to be his voice. Though recordings of a person who may have been him making calls to a television talk show exist in the investigative record and have been examined, there is a partial DNA profile extracted from biological material left on envelope seals that represents the closest thing to a biological trace of whoever committed these crimes. There is a partial palm print lifted from the interior of Paul Stein's taxicab, preserved in the Stein investigation's evidence holdings. There are the letters themselves, physical paper, held in protective enclosures in the SFPD evidence archive, still present, still cataloged, still part of a case file that remains open. The lake at Berryessa is still there, wide and blue-gray against the Napa Hills, its shoreline accessible to people who drive out there for the same reasons anyone drives to a reservoir: the quiet, the space, the water, the distance from the city. The picnic area exists in the same general form it did in September 1969. The fence post where the attacker's writing was found is gone or changed the way outdoor things change over 55 years. The record of what was written there exists in photographs and documented transcriptions held in the Napa County Investigative File. Blue Rock Springs Park still receives visitors on summer evenings. Lake Herman Road still runs east out of Benicia into the same low hills, the same dry grass, the same landscape that holds its color between gold and gray in December. The intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets still exists exactly where it always was, with the same trees, the same quiet residential character, the same curb where a cab once sat on a clear October night. And somewhere in a law enforcement database associated with case numbers belonging to files maintained across multiple Northern California counties, a partial male DNA profile sits in its documented form, a series of genetic markers extracted from cells left on the adhesive of an envelope sealed by a person whose identity has never been confirmed. The profile was produced from biological material that has existed since the day it was deposited, wading through decades of investigative activity and forensic development for a comparison that would resolve the question it represents. The comparisons have been made. New methods have been applied. The profile remains, as it was, a documented forensic result that neither opens nor closes the question it was extracted to answer. It is on file. It is real. It is the most direct biological trace of this case that exists, and it is still there, held in the system that holds such things, unmatched. On the night of October 11th, 1969, a patrol officer named Donald Fook was driving through the quiet residential streets of Presidio Heights when he observed a man walking along Jackson Street. The man was moving at a deliberate pace, away from the intersection of Washington and Cherry, where a yellow cab had been found at the curb, with its driver dead inside. Fook later described the man as heavy-set, white, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing dark clothing and moving with a kind of settled, unhurried purpose through the lamplight and shadow of that particular block. The officer, not yet aware of what had happened at the cab, did not stop the man. He continued past, and the figure receded into the tree-lined dark of the residential street, and that was the last confirmed sighting of anyone resembling the Zodiac in the immediate vicinity of a crime scene that could be attached to a named witness in the official record. Fook's account, which he documented in a written statement and later described in detail to investigators, became one of the most significant witness observations the Zodiac investigation ever produced. It was significant not because it led anywhere decisive, but because it was specific, a direction of travel, a physical description, a street name and a time. These were precise enough to be useful, and in a case where useful material of any kind was difficult to come by, that precision carried weight. Investigators returned to Fuchs' account many times over the years that followed, each return an attempt to match what he had described to someone whose name had entered the file. The composite sketch that emerged in the aftermath of the Steen shooting was built from Fuchs' description and from accounts provided by 3 teenagers who had observed a man near the cab from a window of a nearby house in the minutes before patrol officers arrived. It depicted a broad-faced man with close-cropped hair and heavy dark-rimmed glasses, his features rendered in the flat black and white contrast of a printed police document. Copies were distributed to patrol officers across San Francisco. The image was posted in precincts and public spaces. It was reproduced in newspapers. For the years and then the decades that followed, it became the face most commonly associated with the case. Not a photograph, not a confirmed likeness, but a composite built from what multiple people reported having seen on one particular night, held together by the conventions of forensic illustration into something that looked like a face and was used as one. The sketch was not the only tool investigators had. It was not even the primary one. In the months following the Stein murder and the murders at Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa before it, the agencies working the case assembled what physical forensic evidence they could from the scenes and from the communications the Zodiac had sent to Bay Area newspapers. Fingerprints were lifted from Paul Stein's cab by technicians working in the hours after the shooting. The cab's interior surfaces were examined methodically, dusted and photographed and documented under the artificial light of the crime scene examination. A partial palm print recovered from that interior became one of the most closely held pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation, a specific, tangible artifact that could in theory be placed alongside the prints of a named suspect and either matched or eliminated. The partial palm print was used in direct comparisons over the years against a number of named individuals as they were identified and investigated. Each comparison followed the same procedure. A known exemplar was obtained from the suspect. The examiner placed it alongside the partial lift from the cab. The ridge detail was studied, measured, and assessed. In each case, the comparison did not produce a match. The palm print remained unmatched. It remained on file. It was the kind of evidence that had a potential function. It could, if a sufficient exemplar were ever found from the right person, resolve a significant question about the physical presence of the killer inside the cab, but that function had not yet been activated by the time the years of formal active inquiry had lengthened into decades. Handwriting analysis operated alongside the fingerprint work, though it carried different evidentiary weight and different methodological complications. The Zodiac's letters were distinctive. They were written in block printing that was consistent enough across dozens of communications to suggest a single author over a significant period of time, and the letter formations, pen pressure, and spatial habits of that printing were analyzed by professional document examiners, retained at various points by the investigating agencies. A named suspect's known writing samples would be placed beside reproductions of the Zodiac's letters. The examiners would study the way individual letters were formed, the precise angle of a capital Z, the way a lowercase a was closed, the pressure applied at the beginning and end of each stroke. Their conclusions were reported to investigators and entered into the file. What complicated this analysis from the beginning, and what was recognized as a limitation throughout, was the possibility that the Zodiac had written his letters in a disguised hand. Block printing is inherently less individual than cursive script. The absence of connected letter forms reduces the number of habitual personal characteristics available for comparison, and if the writer had made a conscious effort to alter his natural style, something that could not be confirmed or ruled out from the letters alone, then even the most rigorous comparison carried an unavoidable margin of uncertainty. Investigators noted this limitation. It did not make handwriting analysis useless. It meant that a comparison result, whether it pointed toward or away from a particular suspect, needed to be understood within those constraints. The letters themselves arrived in a pattern that investigation and time would eventually define more clearly. Beginning in the summer of 1969, communications addressed to Bay Area newspapers began to arrive at newsrooms where they were opened and read, and then, with some delay, turned over to law enforcement. The letters contained claims about the murders. They contained ciphers. They contained demands and taunts and references to the killings that included details not publicly known, which was part of what gave them their investigative weight. Analysts studied the language of the letters alongside the physical characteristics of the paper and ink in the stamps and envelopes, each element potentially carrying information that the writer might not have intended to provide. The stamps and envelopes became particularly important later, when advances in biological analysis made it possible to extract DNA material from the gummed surfaces of envelope seals. At the time of the killings and for many years afterward, this possibility did not exist as a practical tool. The envelopes were handled in ways consistent with the evidence handling standards of their era, which meant that they passed through multiple pairs of hands, were examined at multiple agencies, and in some cases were stored under conditions that would not meet the preservation standards applied to biological evidence in later decades. The forensic value of biological material on those surfaces was something investigators in 1969 and through the 1970s had no specific procedural reason to protect. The tip lines that the Bay Area agencies established and maintained brought in something that biological analysis and handwriting comparison could not produce by themselves: names, thousands of them over the years. Civilians called in to name their neighbors, their co-workers, their relatives, their acquaintances. They called in to name people they had seen in newspaper photographs who resembled the composite sketch. They called in to report men who had said something odd, or had moved away suddenly, or had been behaving strangely around the time of the murders. Each name was recorded. Each record became a card in a drawer or a line in a file. The tip lines functioned as a kind of vast, unfiltered netcast across the entire population of Northern California, and what they caught was an enormous volume of material that had to be sorted and assessed and followed up on. The most serious of these tips were logged, assigned, and investigated to the degree the agency's resources allowed. An investigator would be sent to speak with the person who had called in. A background check would be run. The named individual might be interviewed. If there was enough to justify it, a comparison might be requested against the available physical evidence. Most of these investigative threads went nowhere and were closed, the cards returned to the drawer, the names filed and set aside. Some names remained in the file longer, accruing documentation as follow-up interviews produced additional information, or as the same name was submitted by multiple independent sources, or as a detail in the background check produced something that warranted continued attention. What this process generated over the course of years was a suspect file of considerable size, a population of named individuals, each one the subject of some degree of investigative inquiry, each one neither confirmed nor fully eliminated. The agencies working the case were dealing with a killer who had left very limited physical evidence at his scenes, who communicated through letters that could be analyzed but not definitively traced, and who had operated across multiple jurisdictions before the killing activity that could be confirmed had apparently stopped. The tip-generated suspects were in many cases the most active thread available to investigators at any given point. One structural reality of this tip-heavy investigative environment was that many of the names that eventually became prominent in the public account of the case entered the record not through law enforcement profiling or forensic development, but through civilian submission. A member of the public would call in a name. The name would be logged. In some cases, the investigation would pursue it. In others, it would be set aside. The distinction between names that were formally investigated and names that were merely submitted was not always clear in subsequent public discussions of the case. And this created an environment in which the public's understanding of who had been investigated and to what degree was difficult to calibrate accurately. The Vallejo Police Department and the San Francisco Police Department were the two agencies most continuously involved in the Zodiac investigation through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The Valle Department held investigative responsibility for the attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. The SFPD held investigative responsibility for the Stein shooting in Presidio Heights. The Napa County Sheriff's Office maintained its own file on the Lake Berryessa attack. Each of these agencies operated within its own jurisdiction, maintained its own evidence, and conducted its own interviews and follow-up investigations according to its own procedures and priorities. There were interactions between the agencies. Information was shared at various points, and investigators from different departments spoke with one another and at times coordinated their efforts, but the coordination was not structural. There was no centralized command holding all the threads of the Zodiac investigation together, no single office where every piece of evidence from every attack was held and could be cross-referenced against every other piece. The evidence existed in separate facilities, in separate counties, maintained by separate departments, with separate chains of custody and separate filing systems. A partial fingerprint in Vallejo and a handwriting sample in San Francisco were both relevant to the same case, but they were housed in different buildings more than 30 miles apart, and the process of bringing them together for a single comparative analysis required a kind of deliberate logistical effort that did not happen automatically. In the building on Bryant Street where the SFPD's homicide detail worked, the Stein case, there were folders and evidence bags and investigative reports accumulated over months and then years of inquiry. The items in those folders represented what had been gathered from the specific events within the city's jurisdiction: the cab, the crime scene, the witness accounts, the letters addressed to city newspapers. Down in Vallejo, in a different building with a different filing system, the department that had worked the earlier attacks maintained its own accumulation of the same kind of material, gathered from different scenes and different witnesses, stored under a different chain of custody. The physical distance between these two evidence holdings was not large in geographic terms. In investigative terms, the distance was whatever effort was required to bridge it, and that effort was not always made with the consistency or frequency that later analysis suggested it should have been. This was not a feature unique to the Zodiac investigation. Multi-jurisdictional crimes produced coordination challenges that were well understood by law enforcement professionals of that era. The late 1960s and early 1970s predated the technological infrastructure that later made routine information sharing between agencies more feasible. There were no shared databases of the kind that would later allow a fingerprint lifted in one county to be automatically cross-referenced against records held in another. The communication between agencies happened through the established channels of the time: telephone calls, written correspondence, in-person meetings, and was subject to the same institutional and logistical constraints that affected any interagency professional relationship. The Zodiac investigation was exceptional in many ways, but its coordination challenges were not among them. Document examiners, working the handwriting comparisons in this environment, were doing careful, specialized work under conditions that limited what they could conclude. The comparison between the Zodiac's block printing and a suspect's known samples was conducted by professionals applying established methods. When those comparisons produced equivocal results, as they sometimes did, the equivocal result was itself informative. It meant the question remained open. It meant the suspect had not been eliminated on handwriting grounds. It did not mean the suspect had been confirmed. The distinction between failing to eliminate and positively identifying was a consistent methodological constraint in the handwriting analysis, one that examiners noted in their reports and that investigators had to weigh carefully when deciding how to apply the results to their broader inquiry. The physical materials from the Zodiac's communications were stored at the agencies that received them. Original letters sat in evidence archives, in protective enclosures, cataloged under case numbers that remained open. The newspapers that had received the earliest letters had handled them before turning them over to investigators, meaning that some of the original material had passed through multiple hands under conditions that did not prioritize the preservation of trace biological evidence. Later analysis would establish that this early handling reduced the forensic potential of some items. What could be extracted from the surfaces of those early documents depended in part on how carefully the material had been maintained, and that care was inconsistent across the evidence holdings of the multiple agencies and the newspaper offices where the letters had first arrived. The palm print from the cab was in a different category. It had been collected by trained fingerprint technicians using the methods of their time and had been stored as physical evidence within a proper chain of custody from the beginning. It was a known quantity in the evidence record, available for comparison, specific enough to carry weight in an analysis. When it was used in comparisons against named suspects over the years, the procedure was methodologically sound. The absence of a match was a genuine finding, not an ambiguity. Each suspect against whom it was compared and did not match was, on that particular question, eliminated. The palm print remained on file, not as an unsettled question, but as a precise tool, specific, durable, waiting for a comparison that would produce a different result. The composite sketch, by contrast, aged differently. In the years following its distribution, it was reproduced so widely and associated so strongly with the public image of the case that it began to function almost as an icon of the investigation, rather than as an active investigative tool. People who submitted tips through the civilian lines often referenced the sketch as the basis for their submissions, comparing the man they were naming to the printed image they had seen in a newspaper or on a wall. The sketch had originally been intended to help identify an unknown person. Over time, in practice, it was being used in the reverse direction as a template against which named individuals were being compared, rather than as a starting point for developing a name from scratch. Investigators were aware of this limitation. A sketch based on multiple witness accounts, produced under the conditions of that night and distributed across multiple print reproductions, was not a precise instrument, and using it as the primary basis for a suspect's submission or evaluation carried an inherent risk of circular reasoning. None of this made the investigative tools available to the Zodiac case's working investigators without value. The handwriting analysis produced useful documentation, even where it produced inconclusive findings. The palm print comparison eliminated named suspects on clear evidentiary grounds. The tip line submissions generated names that, in some cases, led investigators toward individuals who warranted genuine attention. The composite sketch put a described face into public circulation in a way that produced responses. Each tool did what it was designed to do, within its methodological limits, in the conditions under which it was applied. What the tools collectively failed to produce, across years of application, was a case that could be brought to prosecution. The physical evidence was real. The communications were real. The confirmed crime scenes were documented with the care of professional investigators working under the constraints of their era and jurisdiction. But the evidentiary chain from the physical record to a specific, identifiable, chargeable individual remained incomplete. Each comparison that failed to match, each tip that was followed and closed, each handwriting analysis that returned an equivocal result was a genuine finding. These were not investigative failures. They were the honest results of careful work applied to a case where the available evidence and the investigative tools of the time did not together close the gap between the record and the person who had made it. The years passed. The tip lines remained open, though they received fewer calls as the decade changed, and the killings, as far as the confirmed record showed, did not continue. The evidence archives were maintained. The case files were kept, assigned to cold case units, as formal active investigation became difficult to sustain without new leads. Investigators who had worked the case in its earliest phase eventually retired, and the files passed to others who had come to the case through the record rather than through direct experience of the events. The composite sketch remained in circulation. The palm print remained on file. The handwriting samples remained available for comparison. The letters remained in their protective enclosures in their evidence archives. The case had not been solved. The case had also not been closed. These were two different things, and the investigative record that accumulated between those two facts was substantial. Tens of thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds of named individuals, dozens of formal comparisons, multiple forensic reviews conducted at intervals across more than 50 years. The width of that record was, in its own way, a measure of how seriously the agencies involved had taken the work, and of how consistently the available tools had returned results that fell short of the threshold required to bring the investigation to a different kind of conclusion. In an office of the Vallejo Police Department, in a drawer among many drawers, index cards and typed sheets representing years of civilian tip submissions waited in their organized rows. Each card held a name. Each name had been submitted by someone somewhere in Northern California who had believed the submission was worth making. Some of those names had been followed in full. Some had been followed in part. Some had been logged and assigned a low priority and remained in the file without much having been done with them, because the volume of submissions exceeded the capacity of the investigators to pursue each one with equal energy. The drawer held a record of the public's long engagement with the case, the thousands of ordinary moments in which someone had looked at a neighbor or a coworker or a relative and thought quietly that the composite sketch looked something like someone they knew. The drawer did not hold an answer. The drawer held documentation. These were different things, and the distinction between them was one that investigators working the case had lived with for years, had incorporated into their professional relationship with the file, had accepted as the honest reality of what the investigation had and had not produced. The composite sketch on the wall of the precinct, worn at its edges from reproduction and handling, the palm print card in its protective sleeve, the handwriting samples in their comparative folders, the tip submissions in their alphabetical drawers. Across the bay, in the SFPD's files on the Stein investigation, a different set of drawers held a different accumulation of the same kind of material, gathered from a different jurisdiction, organized under a different case number, stored in a building more than 30 miles from the Vallejo records. It partially overlapped with and rarely touched. The two sets of files were part of the same investigation, in the sense that they documented events connected by evidence, by communication, and by the same unmatched forensic signatures. They were part of separate institutions in the sense that they were maintained, accessed, and applied to investigative decisions by people working within separate structures, with separate chains of command, and separate operational priorities. The investigation had been thorough, within the limits of what thoroughness meant in the conditions of that era and those jurisdictions. The record it produced was extensive. The questions it had been designed to answer remained, after all the interviews and comparisons and tip submissions and forensic reviews, in the same condition they had been at the beginning, documented, measured, and open. The two evidence holdings, one in Vallejo and one in San Francisco, sat in their separate buildings under their separate case numbers, each one a partial record of something that had no complete record anywhere, because the complete record had never been assembled in a single place by a single authority with the standing and the access to hold all of it at once. What Don Chaney told investigators, when he finally put it into formal terms, was that a conversation had taken place in late 1968, before the first confirmed Zodiac attack, before any letter arrived at any newspaper, before the name Zodiac had appeared anywhere in the public record. Denny said that Arthur Lee Allen had spoken to him about wanting to hunt human beings. He said that Allen had mentioned using a name for himself. The name, as Chaney reported it, was Zodiac. That conversation, as investigators later noted, drew their attention toward a man living in Vallejo, California, and the thread it created would remain in active case files for the next 5 decades. It is worth understanding, before going any further, that a reported conversation is not physical evidence. It is what one person told investigators another person said, sometime after that saying occurred. Chaney's account was taken seriously. It shaped the direction of the inquiry in significant ways, and it remained throughout the entire history of the investigation a reported account rather than a corroborated forensic fact, something the record holds as testimony, not as proof. Arthur Lee Allen was born in 1933. He lived much of his adult life in Vallejo, a city in Solano County that sits at the northern end of San Francisco Bay, roughly equidistant from the cities to its south and the rural counties to its north. He had been a school teacher, and he had lost his teaching certification following a conviction for child molestation. He was, by the time investigators began looking at him seriously, a man whose personal history carried a significant criminal record, though that record, on its own, did not connect him to the specific crimes attributed to the Zodiac Killer. When Chaney's account reached investigators, it opened a line of inquiry rather than a case. A name had been associated, by one witness, with a series of violent crimes that had shaken the Bay Area. Law enforcement had a description from witnesses. They had composite sketches. They had a body of letters. What they did not have, in those early months of the investigation, was a confirmed identity and a name offered by a credible acquaintance, attached to a set of details that seemed to intersect with the known evidence, was the kind of thread that investigators were obligated to follow. Allen's name entered the formal investigative record through that thread. He was not identified through fingerprint comparison. He was not surfaced by a DNA database. He was named, as so many suspects in so many cases have been named, because someone who knew him told investigators something he had said. What came after that initial naming would span 20 years of inquiries, interviews, searches, and laboratory comparisons, a sustained investigative attention directed at a single individual that was, by most accounts, without parallel in the history of the case. The first formal encounter between Allen and investigators took place in August 1971, more than 2 years after the confirmed Zodiac crimes. The location was Allen's workplace, a chemical storage facility in Vallejo. The conversation happened across a table in an industrial setting, with 2 investigators asking Allen questions while he responded. What the investigators noted during that interview, and what subsequently became one of the most cited details in the entire case, was the watch Allen was wearing on his wrist. It was a Zodiac brand watch. On its face was a symbol, a crosshair design, a circle divided by crossed lines that resembled the signature the Zodiac Killer had used in his letters. The investigators recorded this observation. Allen acknowledged owning the watch. He offered an explanation. The encounter was documented, and the file moved forward. The watch detail is the kind of detail that accumulates meaning through repetition, noted first in an investigative report, then cited in journalistic accounts, then absorbed into the popular narrative surrounding the case, until it becomes almost impossible to encounter without the weight of all its subsequent contexts already attached. What it was in its original form was an observed fact. A man wore a commercially available watch, branded with a name that matched the self-designated name of an uncaught killer, and the watch bore a design element similar to one used in the killer's correspondence. What it was not, and what no one at the time claimed it to be, was evidence of guilt. The Zodiac brand existed independently of the murders. The crosshair design appeared on a consumer product. These were coincidences, notable, documented, and insufficient. The 1971 interview was not the only one. Allen was interviewed multiple times over the following years. His home was searched. His belongings were examined. Investigators returned to him with new questions as new information developed and as new techniques became available. The sustained nature of this investigative attention reflects, in part, how seriously Cheney's original account was taken, and also how difficult it proved to either confirm or definitively rule out the information it contained. Allen denied any connection to the crimes. He denied being the Zodiac Killer. He continued to live in Vallejo, and investigators continued to find reasons to return to his name in the files. In 1991, 20 years after the first interview at the chemical storage facility, investigators conducted a formal fingerprint comparison between Arthur Lee Allen and the partial palm print that had been recovered from Paul Stine's taxicab following the October 1969 shooting in Presidio Heights. The comparison was specific, documented, and professionally conducted. The result was clear. The partial palm print from Paul Stine's cab did not match Arthur Lee Allen's fingerprints. That finding was entered into the record, and it represented the first formal forensic test of Allen against physical evidence recovered from a confirmed Zodiac crime scene. The result was negative. There was, by that point, a significant body of public material shaping how people thought about Arthur Lee Allen's potential connection to the Zodiac crimes. In 1986, Robert Graysmith, a former San Francisco Chronicle political cartoonist who had been at the newspaper when the Zodiac letters arrived and had spent years assembling a private investigation, published a book called Zodiac. The book named Allen as Graysmith's primary suspect. It detailed the accumulated circumstantial material, the watch, Cheney's account, Allen's criminal history, physical characteristics that Graysmith found consistent with witness descriptions, and a range of further observations and inferences assembled over years of research. The book became a bestseller. It found a wide readership among the many people who had followed the case through newspaper coverage and public discussion since 1969, and who had spent years without any publicly available synthesis of the investigative record. What Graysmith's book offered was a coherent narrative. The case had generated enormous public interest since the first letters arrived at the San Francisco newspapers in the summer of 1969, and that interest had never been satisfied by an arrest or a charge or any official resolution. Into that absence of resolution, a detailed and compellingly written account arrived, an account that arranged the available circumstantial material around a single named individual and presented a case for why that individual was the most plausible suspect. The book was persuasive. It was also, throughout its account of Allen, a work of civilian analysis rather than official finding. The California Department of Justice had not concluded that Allen was the Zodiac Killer. No district attorney had brought charges. No judge had weighed probable cause. The book's conclusions were Graysmith's own. None of this diminishes what Graysmith assembled. The research was extensive. The timeline was carefully constructed. The circumstantial details he cataloged were in many cases genuinely striking. What they were not, and what the investigative record consistently reflected, was forensically confirmed. The distinction matters, and the case file maintained it, even when the popular narrative had in some quarters moved past it. The 1986 publication brought Allen's name to a national readership. It shaped how the public understood the case for the following decade and beyond. When David Fincher adapted the book into a film in 2007, Allen's name moved further still, reaching audiences who had no connection to the original newspaper coverage, no memory of the 1969 letters, and no prior knowledge of the investigation. The film was widely seen and critically well received. It depicted Allen, played by John Carroll Lynch, as the primary suspect. It depicted the accumulation of circumstantial evidence. It depicted the repeated failure of physical forensic tests to confirm what the circumstantial record seemed to suggest. And by depicting all of this, carefully, without claiming a certainty the record did not support, it introduced an entirely new generation to both the case and the enduring uncertainty at its center. What the film did not change, because no creative work could change it, was what the evidence file actually contained. The palm print comparison had produced a negative result. The DNA comparison, which came after the book and before the film, would also produce a negative result. The record did not shift to accommodate the popular narrative, and the popular narrative, to its credit, in both book and film, did not claim that it had. The DNA comparison came in the early 2000s. By that point, Allen had been dead for more than a decade. He had died of heart failure on August 26, 1992, at his home in Vallejo. He was 58 years old. He had never been charged with any Zodiac-related offense in his lifetime. The investigation had continued after his death, partly because the record of circumstantial interest remained, and partly because forensic science had advanced to the point where comparisons that had not been possible during his lifetime were now within reach. At some point in the early 2000s, investigators extracted a DNA profile from biological material on a Zodiac letter stamp and compared it against stored biological material from Allen. The comparison was like the palm print comparison before it, specific, documented, and professionally conducted. The result was, like the palm print comparison, negative. Alan's DNA profile did not match the partial male profile extracted from the Zodiac correspondence. The test had been designed to answer a direct question: whether the biological material left by whoever had sealed a Zodiac letter matched the biological material known to belong to Arthur Lee Allen, and it answered that question without ambiguity. The answer was no. It is possible, when laying out these forensic comparisons in sequence, to read them as a story of elimination, of evidence progressively narrowing the field, and step by step removing the most prominent suspect from contention. That reading is understandable. It follows a certain logic, but it is not entirely accurate, and the investigators who worked the case were careful about the ways in which a negative forensic result could be interpreted. A negative result from a fingerprint comparison means that the fingerprints do not match. It does not mean that the person was not present at the scene. It does not mean that the person had no connection to the crime. A negative result from a DNA comparison means that the DNA does not match. It does not mean that the biological material on the envelope was necessarily left by the killer. It does not mean that the killer licked every envelope. These are distinctions the forensic record itself makes, and they are distinctions that have shaped how cautious analysts discuss the Allen evidence. What the forensic record shows is that no physical evidence was ever confirmed as linking Arthur Lee Allen to any confirmed Zodiac crime scene. That is the documented finding. It is held in the case file alongside the documented circumstantial interest that accumulated over 20 years of inquiry. Both things are true. The record contains both, and the record has never resolved the tension between them. Allen had become, during the years between the 1986 book and his 1992 death, the most publicly scrutinized individual in the history of the case. Other suspects existed in the investigative files, names submitted by civilians, individuals who had drawn the attention of specific investigators, people whose geographical or physical characteristics had placed them in consideration at various points. None of them had been subjected to the sustained formal attention that Allen received. None of their names had been placed before a national readership in a best-selling book. None of them had been the subject of multiple searches, multiple interviews, and multiple formal forensic comparisons. In the public understanding of the case, Allen occupied a singular position, and the case file, with its combination of significant circumstantial material and repeated forensic negatives, reflected a kind of sustained inconclusiveness that was its own form of documentation. The community of people who followed the case closely, researchers, journalists, retired investigators, members of the public who had developed sustained interest over decades, held a range of views about what the Allen record actually meant. Some believed the forensic negatives were decisive, that the absence of a physical match across both fingerprint and DNA comparison was sufficient reason to look elsewhere. Some believed the circumstantial material remained compelling, that the accumulation of coincidences attached to Allen was too dense to dismiss, and that the forensic record left enough interpretive space to maintain the question. Both positions were represented in public discussions of the case. Neither was the official view of any investigating agency. The investigators, who had spent the most time with the case file, tended to speak about Allen with a careful precision, acknowledging the circumstantial weight without overstating the forensic picture, noting the repeated negative results without using them to close a question the record hadn't answered. That precision is its own kind of testimony to how difficult the case had always been to hold. It was not a case where the evidence pointed clearly in one direction. It was not a case where a single decisive test had either confirmed or exonerated a primary suspect. It was a case where an enormous amount of investigative attention, applied over 2 decades to one individual, had produced a record that was simultaneously more detailed and more inconclusive than almost any comparable investigative history in Northern California's documented crime files. What the record of the 1971 workplace interview shows, in the archived account of 2 investigators sitting across a table from a man wearing a watch with a crosshair on its face, is the beginning of a process that would continue with varying intensity for 21 years. What the record of the August 1992 death notice shows is that the process continued even after the subject of it was gone. What the record of the early 2000s DNA comparison shows is that the questions the investigation had carried for decades were put one more time to the physical evidence, and the physical evidence returned its answer in the same form it had always returned its answers to this particular question: unmatched. The watch that Allen wore to that 1971 interview no longer exists as an active evidentiary concern. The investigators who sat across from him at that table are no longer active on the case. The man himself has been dead for more than 30 years. What persists is the file, its documented interviews, its forensic comparison records, its copies of the circumstantial reports that accumulated across 2 decades, its carefully noted negative results. The file does not make an argument. It does not reach a conclusion. It holds what it holds, a sustained inquiry, fully documented, that followed a significant body of circumstantial material through every available forensic test and arrived at the end of that process without confirmation. There is a specific quality to the investigative record in cases of this kind. Cases where the most prominent suspect has died without charge, where the forensic tests produced negatives, where the circumstantial material remains in the file undispelled and unresolved. The record does not close. The agencies holding it do not remove it from the active category simply because the primary suspect is gone. The question the file was assembled to answer is still, in any formal sense, unanswered. Allen's name remains in that file. So does the partial palm print from Paul Stein's cab, with its documented comparison against Allen's prints and its documented negative result. So does the DNA profile extracted from the envelope stamp, with its documented comparison against stored biological material from Allen and its documented negative result. What the investigation found, across 2 decades of directed attention toward one man, was a record that could not be closed but also could not be confirmed. That is the documentary reality of the Arthur Lee Allen inquiry, held as it has always been held, in the case files of the agencies that worked it, in the forensic records of the laboratories that tested it, and in the quiet, persistent fact that no reviewing authority ever found it sufficient to bring a charge. The early years of the investigation had been shaped by urgency, by the knowledge that an identified killer was active, that letters were arriving at newspapers, that the communications were taunting and specific and suggested an intention to continue. That urgency animated the tip lines, the composite sketches, the cross-jurisdictional coordination attempts, the public appeals. By the time Allen died in 1992, that urgency had long since given way to something quieter, the slow accumulation of an investigative record on a case that had not added a confirmed new crime in more than 2 decades, that had not produced a new letter in years, that remained formally open, not because anything new was expected, but because the original questions had never been answered. The transition from an active investigation to a cold case is not a single event. There is no moment when a file is officially reclassified and everyone involved acknowledges that the inquiry has moved into a different register. It happens gradually, a shift in resources, a rotation of assigned investigators, a reduction in the frequency with which the file is actively reviewed. What remains constant is the file itself, and the evidence it contains, and the open case number under which that evidence is cataloged. Allen's death did not close the case. The negative DNA comparison in the early 2000s did not close the case. The case file remains what it has always been, a document of confirmed crimes, documented investigations, and inconclusive forensic comparisons, held in the record systems of agencies that have never produced an arrest. Allen's name is part of that document. So is every negative result attached to it. The crosshair on the watch face, that detail from the 1971 interview that has been repeated in books, articles, documentaries, and films for more than 50 years, is itself a small study in how the investigative record and the popular narrative relate to each other. In the file, it is a noted observation from an interview. In the popular account, it became over time one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in the entire case. The file did not change. The observation remained what it was. But the weight attached to it grew, and the growing weight reflected not anything new the evidence had demonstrated, but something about how the mind assembles significance from accumulated detail. That process, the assembly of significance from accumulated detail, is one of the central features of the Allen inquiry, and more broadly, of the entire Zodiac investigation. The case generated an enormous volume of potential evidence: letters, ciphers, physical descriptions, fingerprints, DNA material, witness accounts, and decades of civilian and professional analysis. None of it, in any formal forensic sense, pointed unambiguously to a confirmed individual. All of it, taken together, had the weight and texture of something that should have resolved but hadn't, and that accumulated weight attracted sustained attention year after year in the absence of any official closing. What Arthur Lee Allen's investigative record represents, read at this distance, is a comprehensive examination of the most prominent named suspect in a major unresolved case carried out by professional investigators over more than 20 years, ending in a documented series of negative forensic results and an open file. It represents the work of the investigation without the resolution the work was designed to produce, and it sits in the case record exactly as it has always sat, fully documented, carefully maintained, and quietly inconclusive. The early 2000s DNA comparison was not the last time investigators would work with the evidence in this case. Other reviews followed. Other extraction methods became available. Other comparisons were conducted. But the comparison of Allen's stored biological material against the profile extracted from the Zodiac correspondence remains in the record as one of the most specific and direct forensic tests ever applied to the most investigated suspect the case ever produced. It was designed to answer a direct question. It answered that question. The answer neither confirmed nor, in the full interpretive sense, resolved what the file had always held, a documented inquiry that followed its most prominent thread as far as the available forensic tools could take it, and arrived, at each stage, at the same honest result. That result, negative, documented, unambiguous in its forensic terms, but inconclusive in its broader implications, sits in the evidence record alongside Allen's name, alongside Cheney's reported account of a conversation in 1968, alongside the noted observation of a watch worn to a 1971 interview, alongside 20 years of documented inquiry. The record does not argue for any of these details over any others. It holds them together in the flat, careful language of case documentation as the assembled factual history of an investigation that asked every question it knew how to ask and received, in the end, only the answers the physical evidence was capable of giving. The file is still open. Alan's name is still in it. The DNA profile extracted from the Zodiac correspondence is still on file with law enforcement. The comparison was conducted, the result was documented, and the result, the specific measured output of a forensic procedure applied to stored biological material belonging to the most investigated suspect in the history of the case, neither confirmed the most prominent theory the investigation ever held, nor closed the question it was designed to resolve. That is the record. It is held, as it has always been held, in the documentation of an investigation that worked for 2 decades on one thread, and arrived, at the end of those 2 decades, with a result that was exactly as complicated as the case had always been. In the early 1980s, a privately printed document made its way through a small particular world, a loose network of researchers who had spent years following the Zodiac case through newspaper archives and photocopied police reports and correspondence passed between interested parties by ordinary post. The document was not published by a newspaper. It had not been requested by any law enforcement agency. It was the work of a writer named Gareth Penn, and in it Penn set out his conclusion that a San Francisco area journalist named Richard Gaykowski was the Zodiac Killer. The analysis had taken years to assemble. It reached at first only a few hundred readers, and in that quiet, limited circulation, Richard Gaykowski's name entered the public record of the Zodiac case for the first time. Penn's argument rested on several categories of comparison. He examined what he described as similarities between Gaykowski's handwriting and the block print script found in the Zodiac letters. He noted geographical coincidences he considered meaningful, the proximity of Gaykowski's known movements to locations relevant to the case. He also pointed to a recording of a telephone call made to a Bay Area television talk show shortly after the October 1969 killing of cab driver Paul Stein, a call that some researchers had attributed to the Zodiac, and Penn claimed that a voice recording of Gaykowski resembled the caller's voice. These were Penn's conclusions. No law enforcement agency reviewed them and formally endorsed his findings. No forensic laboratory was asked to evaluate the handwriting comparison against a verified standard. The analysis existed as a private document, advancing a private claim, and the distance between those two facts, the claim and the verification, would remain constant for everything that followed. Richard Gaykowski had worked as a journalist and as an editor of underground newspapers in the San Francisco area during the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a recognizable figure in the countercultural press world of that period. He had photographed events, filed stories, and moved through the same city in which much of the Zodiac correspondence had originated. Penn found these facts significant. Investigators who reviewed Penn's conclusions did not find them sufficient. The case file that might have been opened following a formal forensic review, a file containing evidence submitted for laboratory analysis, a comparison of biological material, a systematic interview record, was not opened. What existed instead was the analysis itself, circulating among people interested in the case, growing slowly in reach as the years passed and the internet made older documents more widely available. The gap between civilian analysis and formal forensic procedure is not a small one. A handwriting comparison conducted by a private researcher working from photocopies does not carry the same evidentiary weight as one conducted by a certified document examiner, working from originals submitted through proper chains of custody. A claimed voice match identified by an interested party listening to recordings does not constitute a finding in any document that law enforcement would act upon. This is not a criticism of the researchers who produced these analyses. It is simply the structural reality of how evidence is assessed inside the system that holds the authority to name a suspect and pursue a charge. The analysis Penn produced was the work of a dedicated investigator operating entirely outside that system. His conclusions were his own. They were never tested inside the mechanism that tests such things. Gaikowski himself died in 2004. He had never been publicly charged with anything related to the Zodiac case. No law enforcement agency ever issued a statement naming him as a primary suspect. The comparison forms, the documents that would have recorded a fingerprint comparison, a DNA result, a formal forensic verdict, were never filed in his name. What remains is the analysis, still accessible, still read by people who follow the case, still occupying the particular status of a claim that was made carefully and seriously and never resolved in any direction by the institution that would have the authority to resolve it. Lawrence Kane, who was also known as Lawrence K., came to researchers' attention through a different pathway. Kane had lived in South Lake Tahoe in the early 1970s, in a period that overlapped with the disappearance of a woman named Donna Lass. Lass had worked as a nurse at a Lake Tahoe casino and had vanished in September 1970. She was never found. Her case was investigated by law enforcement and remained open, but it was never officially confirmed as part of the Zodiac series. Some researchers believed it should be. Among the details they noted was the fact that Kane had reportedly lived in the same apartment complex as Lass during the period preceding her disappearance. The question of whether Donna Lass was a Zodiac victim is itself unresolved in the formal record. A postcard received by the San Francisco Chronicle around the time of her disappearance was examined by investigators and considered by some to be a Zodiac communication referencing her case, though this was never definitively established. The card's authorship was not confirmed. The connection between the case and the confirmed Zodiac crimes was suggested, considered, and left in the inconclusive column of the investigative file. Whether Lass's disappearance belonged to the same series as the confirmed killings, the December 1968 murders at Lake Herman Road, the July 1969 attack at Blue Rock Springs, the September 1969 events at Lake Berryessa, the October 1969 shooting on Washington Street, was a question that investigators declined to answer definitively, and it remains unanswered in the official record. Kane had a documented history of erratic and disturbing behavior in other contexts. He had suffered a brain injury and had been involved in incidents that had brought him to the attention of authorities in ways unrelated to the Zodiac case. Researchers who examined him as a suspect pointed to these facts, to his proximity to Lass, to physical characteristics they believed matched the composite sketch. They compared writing samples. They noted patterns they considered significant. None of this was presented to a forensic laboratory in a formal comparison that produced a documented result. Kane died in 2010. He had not been charged with any Zodiac crime. What the record holds, in his case as in others, is the gap between the suspicion and the test, the space where the evidence required for a formal proceeding was never assembled. It is worth pausing to consider how this investigative world functioned in practice, particularly before the internet reorganized how research of this kind was conducted and shared. In the years following the Zodiac murders, a small, loosely connected community of private investigators worked on the case from outside any official structure. They collected newspaper clippings. They obtained photocopies of publicly available case documents through records requests. They corresponded with each other by post. They published findings in small newsletters and self-produced pamphlets that circulated within the community. The work was serious. The hours spent on it were real. The analytical methods, handwriting comparison, geographic mapping, timeline reconstruction, were modeled on professional investigative techniques. But the outputs of this work accumulated in a private archive, separate from the official case files held in police storage, and the two bodies of material rarely intersected in the formal, procedural way that would have been required to turn a civilian finding into an evidentiary one. The internet changed the reach of this work without changing its fundamental status. When websites began hosting detailed analyses of named suspects, the audience for that work expanded from a few hundred interested readers to anyone anywhere who typed the right words into a search engine. The arguments became more accessible. The suspect names became more widely known. The volume of public engagement with the case increased substantially. But the forensic comparison forms remained blank. The DNA profiles remained unmatched. The fingerprint cards remained in their files, compared against some named individuals and not others. The expansion of the civilian investigative community's reach did not change what was true about the evidentiary record. It changed only who knew about the arguments being made within that community. Michael Butterfield occupied a particular place in this landscape. Over a period of many years, Butterfield maintained and published detailed analytical work examining the evidentiary claims made against named Zodiac suspects. His approach was methodical. He applied consistent standards of skepticism, not to dismiss any particular suspect, but to examine whether the evidence cited in support of each identification actually supported the claims being made about it. He documented the ways in which the same limited set of confirmed facts had been assembled into different narratives by different researchers, each narrative selecting the facts that supported its conclusion and placing less weight on those that did not. He noted where confirmation bias had shaped interpretive work. He named the difference between a compelling coincidence and a supported forensic finding. His work became a reference resource for journalists, for researchers, and for people who wanted to understand not just what was claimed about the Zodiac case, but how those claims had been constructed and what they actually rested on. Butterfield's contribution was not a suspect identification. It was a methodology. Where others had asked who the Zodiac was, he asked whether the available evidence was sufficient to answer that question reliably for any named individual, and his conclusion, consistently and carefully documented, was that it was not. The analytical apparatus that had been built around Arthur Lee Allen, around Richard Gaikowski, around Lawrence Kane, and other named individuals, was in each case a structure of inference built on circumstantial material that had never been subjected to the kind of formal forensic scrutiny that would allow for a definitive result. The arguments were sometimes sophisticated. The researchers who made them were sometimes highly intelligent and deeply committed. The conclusions remained, in every case, in the category of unverified. There were researchers who brought linguistic analysis to the Zodiac letters. This work attempted to characterize the writer's syntactic habits, the structures preferred, the vocabulary chosen, the rhythm of sentences, the way clauses were arranged. Written style, like handwriting, carries patterns that can sometimes be compared across documents. If the Zodiac letter writer had a sufficiently distinctive way of constructing sentences, and if a named suspect had produced enough known writing to allow a comparison, there was at least a theoretical basis for the attempt. Some researchers spent months assembling comparison pages, passages from Zodiac letters on the left margin, passages from a suspect's known correspondence on the right, each line annotated with observations about word choice and phrasing and the way ideas were sequenced. The methodology had precedence in academic linguistics. Authorship attribution studies had been applied to anonymous historical documents, to disputed literary works, to cases involving forged signatures and contested manuscripts. There were frameworks and journals and professional standards within the academic study of such things. What the Zodiac analyses generally lacked was peer review conducted against those professional standards. The comparisons were produced outside the academic system that test such claims, published in contexts, websites, self-produced booklets, forum threads, where the scrutiny applied was the scrutiny of an interested lay audience, rather than the scrutiny of specialists equipped to evaluate the methodology. Law enforcement did not adopt linguistic analysis as a primary investigative tool in the Zodiac case. No district attorney's office cited a stylistic comparison in any document approaching formal accusation. The analysis existed in the same category as the handwriting comparisons and the geographic mappings, serious work, carefully done in some instances, and not sufficient to move any named individual from the column of suspects to the column of formally established things. This is not unusual. The Zodiac case was not the only unresolved investigation in which a substantial body of civilian analytical work accumulated around named suspects without producing anything a prosecutor could act upon. The structure of the problem is the same in such cases. The formal evidentiary threshold, the standard of probable cause, the requirement for documented forensic findings with confirmed chain of custody, the procedural requirements that govern what a court will admit, cannot be met by analysis conducted outside the system that applies those standards. The civilian investigators who worked the Zodiac case were not failing to find evidence that was there and waiting to be found. They were working with the same limited confirmed material that law enforcement had been unable to use and trying to do more with it than the material would support. There were names that entered the public conversation about the Zodiac case and then faded, their mention in connection with the crimes a brief period in a larger life. There were families of named suspects who lived with the particular difficulty of having a relative publicly associated with one of the most famous unresolved homicide cases in American history, without that association ever being confirmed or formally withdrawn. The case had accumulated a long list of names over the decades, names submitted to tip lines, names proposed in books and articles, names discussed in online forums, and broadcast in documentary programs. Each name represented a person. Each person had a life that extended before and after the period of the crimes, had relationships and work, and a presence in the world that was not reducible to the question of whether they were or were not the Zodiac. The way a name becomes associated with an unresolved case is not always a careful process. The tip lines established by Bay Area law enforcement agencies in the years following the murders received thousands of submissions. Some were well considered, accompanied by specific observations and documented reasoning. Others were brief, driven by personal animosity or the pattern seeking that a highly publicized case provokes in people who want to help. Many names were submitted by family members, the suspicious sibling, the estranged spouse, the neighbor who had always seemed somehow off. The files that held these submissions accumulated over years into a record of the ways people project, misremember, and fit the known into the suspected. Law enforcement investigators had to evaluate them all. Most led nowhere that could be confirmed. Richard Gaikowski's name had not appeared in those tip-line files in the early period. Penn's analysis came later, in a different mode, not a phone call to a detective's desk, but a privately circulated document arguing a case. The pathway into the public record was different for different suspects. Arthur Lee Allen had been named by a personal acquaintance, Don Cheney, who brought his concern directly to investigators in 1971. Lawrence Kane entered the research community's attention through geographic coincidence and the work of researchers who had been systematically examining the lives of people who had moved through relevant locations in relevant periods. Each pathway had its own logic and its own limitations. What all of them shared was the final step that was never taken, the forensic test that would have produced a documented result capable of surviving the scrutiny of an evidentiary standard. The men and women who spent years working on the Zodiac case from outside official structures were not, in the main, motivated by anything other than the genuine desire to resolve a question that had been left open. The case had a quality that drew sustained attention. The confirmed crimes had occurred across a narrow window of time, less than a year between the first attack and the last confirmed one, and the perpetrator had then apparently stopped, or at least had stopped sending letters that investigators considered genuine. The sudden silence after a period of active correspondence created a particular kind of unresolved feeling. The letters that had been sent were still there, held in evidence. The forensic material extracted from their seals was still there, held in databases. The silence after them was there too, equally persistent, and it had never been explained. Researchers who spent years on the case came to know its confirmed facts with a depth of familiarity that few investigators outside the dedicated cold case units could match. They knew the timing of each confirmed attack. They knew the geographical distances between locations. They knew the dates of each letter, the distinctive features of each communication, the minor inconsistencies that investigators had noted in the correspondence over the decades. They had read the books, examined the published documents, filed public records requests, and in some cases interviewed witnesses and peripheral figures directly. The knowledge was real, the commitment was real. The conclusions that emerged from that knowledge remained in the category of the unverified, not because the researchers were wrong to pursue them, but because verification requires something that civilian investigators cannot supply, the formal forensic authority that turns a comparison into a finding and a finding into something a court can weigh. In 2007, the David Fincher film based on Robert Graysmith's book brought the case to a much wider audience. Arthur Lee Allen was the film's central suspect. The story it told of investigators circling a probable killer without ever accumulating quite enough evidence to act was compelling in part because it was drawn from a real investigative history. But the film was a film, and the Graysmith book, from which it drew, was a work of journalism rather than a case file, and the distinction mattered for how the record was understood by people encountering it for the first time. The narrative form of a film has a logic that confirmed facts and unresolved investigations resist. A film moves toward something. The Zodiac case did not move toward anything. It remained where it had been, and where it still is, in the administrative holding pattern of an open file with a partial DNA profile and a set of original letters in protective enclosures in a police archive. The effect of the film on the civilian investigative community was predictable. The audience for work on the case expanded significantly. New voices entered the discussion. New suspect names were proposed. New analyses were published to websites and forums. The quality of these contributions varied widely. Some were careful and methodical. Some were loose and impressionistic. Some were driven by the same confirmation bias that Butterfield had spent years documenting in the older literature, the tendency to weight evidence that supported a favored conclusion and to look past evidence that complicated it. The film did not change what the evidence contained. It changed how many people were examining it, and with what prior convictions about what they expected to find. Lawrence Kane's name had been in circulation among dedicated researchers for years before the wider audience the film generated. The details of his case were familiar to anyone who had spent time in the research community. But each wave of new interest brought his name and Gaikowski's name and others to people who were encountering them for the first time, and in that re-encounter, the names tended to arrive without the full weight of what had not been confirmed about them. The cases for these suspects were presented, in summary form, with their most compelling elements foregrounded, and their most fundamental limitation, the absence of any forensic confirmation, sometimes underemphasized or noted only briefly. The pattern was not unique to the Zodiac case. It is a recurring feature of how unresolved cases are discussed in popular form. The methodological standard that Butterfield maintained, the insistence on distinguishing what was confirmed from what was inferred, on naming the evidentiary gap, on not allowing the persuasiveness of a narrative to substitute for the rigor of a forensic result, was not universally adopted in the wider community that engaged with the case. It was adopted by some. It influenced the way certain journalists and researchers wrote about suspect claims. It provided a check against the worst impulses of the confirmation-prone interpretive work that accumulated around each named individual. But the standard itself could not fill the gap it identified. What was missing from every civilian suspect analysis was not a better methodology. It was the physical forensic result that only a formal comparison procedure, conducted with appropriate materials and within appropriate chains of custody, could produce. The blank comparison form, the forensic laboratory document awaiting a formal submission that would initiate the testing process, is perhaps the most honest image of where the civilian investigative record stands in relation to every suspect discussed in this way. The form exists, the procedure exists. The authority to initiate the procedure rests with law enforcement, and law enforcement's decision to initiate it rests on an evidentiary threshold that the circumstantial material assembled around Gaikowski, around Kane, and around other civilians identified suspects has not been found to meet. The researchers who assembled that material worked seriously and documented carefully. Their work sits beside the blank form, extensive and detailed, and in the specific sense that matters for the question of who the Zodiac was, unanswered. There is a particular quality to following a case that has accumulated decades of serious analytical work without arriving at a resolution. The research community that grew around the Zodiac case was not a marginal or uninformed one. It produced detailed documentation. It developed internal debates about methodology. It held named suspects to account for inconsistencies in the claims made about them. Butterfield's work, and the work of others who applied similar standards, created a kind of institutional memory for the case, a record of what had been claimed, what had been tested, and what had been found wanting, not by laboratory analysis, but by the application of consistent critical standards to the available evidence. That record persists. It is accessible. It represents a decades-long effort to think carefully about a set of confirmed facts that have never resolved into a confirmed identity. The names that passed through this process, Gaikowski, Kane, and many others less widely known, carry a particular kind of weight in the record. They are the names of real people who became associated through civilian analysis and public discussion with one of the most examined unresolved criminal cases in American history. None of them were ever charged. None of them were ever the subject of a forensic finding that placed them at a confirmed Zodiac crime scene. The circumstantial material assembled around each of them was examined, discussed, argued over, and left, in every case, in the column of things that were alleged rather than established. The forensic comparison form, in its blank state, represents not a failure of the researchers who worked toward it, but a factual description of where the process stopped. The civilian investigators who named suspects and assembled cases could not complete the final step. That step belongs to a different institution, one with the authority to compel cooperation, to submit evidence through proper channels, to produce a result that would survive legal scrutiny. The analysis produced outside that institution accumulated beside the blank form, year by year, careful and extensive and incomplete in the specific way that matters most. The form waited. The case file remained open. The names in the research record remained exactly what they had always been, names under examination, held in the careful, inconclusive space between allegation and fact, where they remain and where the record holds them still. The prosecutors who reviewed the Zodiac case files at various points across the decades returned, repeatedly, to the same legal threshold, probable cause. The standard required not certainty, not a preponderance of intuition, not the accumulated weight of years of circumstantial attention, but a documented factual basis sufficient to justify a lawful arrest and to survive the scrutiny of a preliminary hearing before a judge. What those prosecutors found, when they sat with the files and measured the available evidence against that standard, was that the record fell short. This was not a conclusion reached once and then forgotten. It was reached again and again across different reviewing offices and different decades, each time producing the same quiet result. The evidence was not enough. The case against Arthur Lee Allen, which represented the strongest and most extensively developed case against any named suspect, illustrated the problem in its clearest form. The circumstantial record surrounding Allen was substantial by the standards of circumstantial evidence. A conversation reported by an acquaintance, a watch bearing a symbol, geographic proximity to confirmed crime locations, physical characteristics that placed him within the range of witness descriptions. These were the kinds of details that in a different case might have formed the outer edge of something prosecutable. Provided physical forensic evidence existed to anchor them, physical forensic evidence in this instance did not. The partial palm print lifted from Paul Stein's cab had been compared against Allen's known prints and had not matched. The biological material extracted from Zodiac envelope seals had been compared against Allen's stored DNA profile and had not matched. Without that physical anchor, the circumstantial record, extensive as it was, could not carry the legal weight required. The prosecutors who said so were not dismissing the investigation. They were applying the standard the system requires and finding that the record, as it stood, did not clear it. This is the kind of conclusion that can seem, from the outside, like a failure of nerve. It is not. A preliminary hearing before a judge is not a theoretical exercise. It is a proceeding in which the prosecution must demonstrate, on the record and in open court, that the evidence in hand justifies the deprivation of a person's liberty. The standard exists because the alternative, arresting individuals on the basis of compelling suspicion, unsupported by physical evidence, produces its own documented category of injustice. The prosecutors who reviewed the Zodiac files and declined to proceed were not concluding that Allen was innocent. They were concluding that the evidence did not yet reach the required threshold, and that proceeding without it would not serve the case, the law, or the record. The evidence itself had, by that point, its own complicated history. The original Zodiac letters had passed through many hands before modern forensic methods existed to extract biological trace material from them. Fingerprint technicians had dusted surfaces at a time when DNA analysis was not a forensic tool. Evidence bags had been opened, resealed, and stored across multiple agencies and across multiple decades with the ordinary handling that comes with long storage and institutional transfer. Some of the most potentially significant physical items in the case, the letters themselves, the envelopes, the stamps, had accumulated handling histories that by the time modern extraction methods became available had introduced contamination risks that could not be fully accounted for. This was not negligence. It was the consequence of evidence being processed by its era's available methods. And what could be extracted from a sealed envelope in 1969 was not what could be extracted in 2004. And what investigators in 1969 could not have known was that the envelope itself was a potential biological record that might outlast every other line of inquiry. When the SFPD Cold Case Unit revisited the Zodiac materials in 2004, they brought extraction methods and comparative databases that had not existed during the original investigation. They retrieved original letters, fingerprint cards, and evidence bags from long-term storage and laid them out under controlled conditions. What they produced was the most complete DNA profile of the presumed letter writer that had been obtained to that point, more detailed than earlier extractions, more suitable for database comparison. That profile was run against available criminal databases. It was compared against samples from named suspects. It did not produce a confirmed match in any instance. The work done in 2004 was thorough. It was methodical. It extended the reach of the investigation into territory that had not previously been accessible. And it arrived at the same place the investigation had always arrived, a documented result that was definitive only in what it excluded. The jurisdictional structure of the case had from the beginning shaped the kind of investigation it was possible to conduct. The confirmed Zodiac attacks occurred across at least 4 separate county jurisdictions: Solano, Napa, San Francisco, and potentially Riverside, each with its own law enforcement agencies, its own prosecutors, and its own independent filing systems. No single district attorney held jurisdiction over the complete set of crimes. No single agency was ever formally designated as the coordinating authority across all confirmed attack sites. The investigation proceeded as a series of parallel efforts, sometimes communicating, sometimes not, each one working from the portion of the case that fell within its geographic and legal authority. This was not a failure of individual investigators. It was a structural reality of American policing, which assigns authority by geography and has no established mechanism for automatically consolidating files when a series of crimes crosses county lines. The Zodiac case was, in this respect, a study in what that structure costs. A single district attorney's office working with a consolidated case file might have identified earlier that the strongest prosecutable angle required forensic evidence that had not yet been prioritized. A single coordinating agency might have ensured that fingerprint comparisons and DNA extractions were applied systematically and simultaneously rather than sequentially and independently. These are reasonable observations about the structure, and they have been made by retrospective analysts over many years. Making them is not the same as saying that someone failed. The investigation operated within the legal and logistical framework available to it. The framework was not designed for this kind of case. That the case remains open is in part a consequence of that structural reality, documented and acknowledged and neither easily resolved nor reasonably blamed on any single office or officer. The question of what constitutes sufficient evidence in a case like this one has its own extended history in legal and investigative scholarship. Circumstantial evidence has supported prosecutions before. Geographic proximity, behavioral indicators, physical resemblance, and access have formed the factual basis of cases that were brought and convictions that were returned. The difference in every instance where that kind of case succeeded was physical evidence at the point of connection, something that placed a specific identified person at a specific confirmed location at a specific documented time. In the Zodiac case, that connection point was never established. The partial palm print from Paul Stein's cab is the closest physical link between a crime scene and an unknown person, and it has been compared against named suspects without matching any of them. The DNA profile is the closest biological link between the letter writer and an unknown person, and it has been compared against the same. Neither has closed the gap. What remains, then, is a record, a specific and detailed and extensively examined record held across multiple institutions and maintained in multiple formats, representing more than 5 decades of investigative attention and forensic work. The original letters are in the custody of the San Francisco Police Department's Evidence Archive, stored in protective enclosures, cataloged under case numbers that have been open since 1969. The fingerprint cards are on file. The DNA profile is on file. The comparison results, every negative, every exclusion, every instance in which a named suspect was measured against the physical evidence and found not to match, are documented in the investigative record. The case is formally open. It has been formally open since the first complaint was filed. It will remain formally open until it is closed, and the only thing that closes it is an arrest and a prosecution, or a formal determination by the relevant authorities that the case has reached a point at which active investigation can no longer be meaningfully conducted. There is a way of understanding that persistence that has nothing to do with suspense and nothing to do with the particular identity of whoever sent those letters. What the open file means, in its most concrete and least dramatic form, is that the record is preserved, the evidence is maintained, and the forensic work can continue whenever new tools or new information become available. Cold case investigations have produced prosecutions and identifications in cases that were older than the Zodiac case is now, cases in which DNA technology, applied decades after the original investigation, produced a match in a database that did not exist when the crime was committed. That possibility exists here. The profile is on file. The databases are updated. What is not known is whether the person whose biological material was used to seal those envelopes ever entered a criminal database, whether their DNA is stored anywhere against which a comparison can be run, whether the profile extracted from those aged and handled envelopes is sufficiently complete to return a match, even if one exists. Those are questions the record cannot currently answer. They are held, as the rest of the case is held, in the specific practical reality of an open investigation, a status that carries neither the drama of an active hunt nor the closure of a formal resolution, but something quieter and more accurate, the sustained administrative and forensic attention of institutions that have not stopped, that have not closed, and that continue to hold what they hold. The DNA profile itself, a partial male profile, extracted from biological material on Zodiac envelope seals, rendered as a series of numerical loci on a genetic chart, is a particular kind of document. It exists. It is on file. It represents, in its current form, the most direct surviving biological trace of the person who sealed those envelopes and sent those letters to those newspapers In the summer and autumn of 1969, it is not a name, it is not a face, it is a molecular record of a person who, 50 years later, remains identified only by a case number and a cipher signature and a series of attacks that stretched across 4 Northern California counties over the course of 1 year. The profile does not answer the question. It holds the question open in the most specific and scientifically grounded form available. Running that profile against state and federal criminal databases is a procedural step that has been carried out. The result, each time, has been negative, meaning that no one whose DNA is held in those databases has been found to match the profile from the envelopes. That negative result is itself a documented finding. It means that if the profile is accurate and the envelopes were sealed by the same person who committed the confirmed attacks, then that person either never entered the criminal databases or entered them with biological material that was cataloged at too early a date, or was never arrested for anything that resulted in DNA collection, or is no longer living. Any of those conditions is possible. The case record cannot distinguish between them. Arthur Lee Allen died in August 1992, and the DNA comparison that would have been most significant, the comparison against material extracted from a Zodiac stamp conducted in the early 2000s, was performed against stored biological material collected from Allen. It produced a negative result. That result can be read in 2 ways, and both readings are honest. One reading is that it excludes Allen, that the biological evidence does not support his identification as the Zodiac writer, and that the decades of investigative attention focused on him may have been focused on the wrong person. The other reading, advanced by investigators and researchers who consider the positive result improbable for other technical reasons, is that the envelope material may have been contaminated, or that Allen did not personally seal the envelopes even if he wrote the letters, or that the extracted profile represents a contributor other than the intended subject. Neither reading can be confirmed. Both are documented positions in the investigative literature. The case file holds them both, without resolving the tension between them. This is the kind of ambiguity that is, in practice, the Zodiac case. It is a case that accumulated an unusually extensive documentary record: letters, ciphers, forensic comparisons, witness accounts, tip line submissions, civilian analyses, academic papers, and produced from all of that a set of documented exclusions and a persistent unknown. What the record shows is not nothing. It shows where the investigation went, what tools it applied, which paths were followed to their ends, and where each path stopped. The path through fingerprint comparison stopped at a negative result. The path through DNA comparison stopped at a negative result. The path through handwriting analysis stopped at a professional disagreement that could not be resolved by adding further examples. The path through civilian research stopped, in every instance, at the gap between naming a suspect and producing physical forensic evidence sufficient to connect that suspect to a crime scene. That gap, the distance between the documentary evidence and the physical forensic link that would close the case, has remained constant through every stage of the investigation. In the late 1960s, it was a gap between witness descriptions and an unidentified person. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was a gap between the composite sketch and the fingerprint comparison that failed to match. In the 1990s and 2000s, it was a gap between the named suspect who accumulated the most circumstantial interest and the DNA profile that would not confirm him. In the decades since, it has been the gap between a stored profile and a matching sample that has not yet been found. The gap is the case. It has not changed shape. It has only been examined from different directions, with increasingly precise instruments, each examination producing a clearer picture of exactly where the gap lies without closing it. There is something worth staying with in the physical reality of the original evidence. The letters, paper, and ink, handwritten in block printing, addressed to newspaper offices in San Francisco in 1969, are still in existence. They are not historical abstractions or digital records or photographed reproductions, though reproductions of them circulate widely and have been studied in detail by researchers across 50 years. The original documents are physical objects held in protective enclosures in the SFPD Evidence Archive, cataloged under the case numbers they were assigned when they arrived. The paper has aged. The ink has not changed. The handwriting is the same handwriting it was on the day each letter was completed. The biological trace on the sealed flaps is, to whatever extent modern extraction can still find it, still there. These objects are a particular kind of persistence. They have outlasted several of the investigators who first handled them, and the editors who received them, and the named suspects against whom they were compared. They have outlasted the newspaper offices to which they were sent, in the sense that those offices have moved and merged and transformed in the 50 years since the letters arrived. The letters themselves have not changed. They are held where they are held, and they remain what they are, the written record of a person whose identity has not been established, produced by a hand that has not been matched, sealed by lips that left biological material that has not yet found its match in any database. The SFPD Evidence Archive that holds them is a building with shelves and cataloged storage and institutional procedures for maintaining the chain of custody of physical evidence in open cases. It is not a dramatic place. It is the kind of facility that does what it does without any particular ceremony: receiving, cataloging, storing, maintaining, making available to investigators what investigators need access to. The Zodiac letters are in it. The fingerprint cards are in it. The case files are in it. They have been there for more than 5 decades, and they will remain there for as long as the case is open and the facility maintains them. This is the specific institutional form that the unresolved question takes, not an abstract mystery, not a narrative without an ending, but a box in a room, in a building, with a catalog number, checked out when it needs to be checked out, and returned when it is returned, holding what it holds, and waiting with the particular patience of maintained objects in a functioning archive. The other jurisdictions hold their portions of the record independently. Napa County's materials from the Lake Berryessa attack are cataloged in Napa. Solano County's materials from the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs locations are held in Solano. Whatever materials Riverside County retained in connection with the Bates case, which was considered potentially related, though never officially confirmed as part of the series, are held in Riverside. These are separate files in separate buildings in separate county systems, each one representing the portion of a larger record that happened to fall within that county's legal jurisdiction. They were not designed to speak to one another. They are not a unified archive. They are, in their separateness, a structural feature of the case, the administrative geography of an unresolved series of crimes, spread across a map that did not conform to any single legal boundary. The San Francisco file is the most extensive. San Francisco received the letters. San Francisco investigated the Stein murder. The SFPD's Cold Case Unit conducted the 2004 review. The SFPD's Evidence Archive holds the original correspondence. In this sense, San Francisco is the institutional home of the case's documentary center, even though San Francisco was only one of the jurisdictions in which the confirmed attacks occurred. The Vallejo murders were investigated by Vallejo. The Lake Berryessa attack was investigated by Napa County. The case was never anyone's case in the sense of being wholly owned and centrally held. It was always a collection of adjacent cases that shared an offender or were believed to share an offender and were worked in parallel by agencies that communicated imperfectly and stored their findings independently. That structure is a documented fact about the investigation, not a secret uncovered by retrospective criticism. The investigators who worked the case in 1969 knew they were working within a fragmented structure. They communicated across county lines when they communicated. They shared what they shared when the sharing was arranged. They operated within the administrative framework available to them, and the framework for a series of crimes that crossed jurisdictions in this way was simply not designed for what the case required. Acknowledging this is not an assignment of blame. It is an accurate description of the conditions under which the investigation was conducted, conditions that helped determine the shape of the record that was ultimately produced. That record in its current form is what it has always been: extensive, carefully documented, and incomplete. It contains thousands of tip submissions, hundreds of suspect evaluations, multiple rounds of fingerprint and DNA comparison, the complete set of authenticated letters and their analysis, the forensic findings from each crime scene, the witness accounts collected in the aftermath of each confirmed attack, and the accumulated investigative conclusions of multiple agencies over more than 50 years. What it does not contain is the answer to the central question. The name has never been entered into the file at the level of confirmed identification. The match has never been made. The case number is still open. The profile on file represents a specific person. Whatever else can be said about the Zodiac case, whatever the correct interpretation of the circumstantial evidence, whatever the ultimate resolution of the contested DNA results, the profile extracted from the biological material on those envelope seals belongs to someone. It is a molecular record of a real individual, a person who existed, who handled paper and pen and a stamp and the gummed edge of an envelope and sent letters to newspapers, and who left behind a biological signature that modern forensic science was able to extract and characterize. That person was alive at some point. The profile is a record of their having existed. The case file is the record of what they did, or what someone who sent those letters did, in the specific documented geography of Northern California over a period of approximately 10 months, beginning in late 1968. The profile is not a ghost. It is a forensic document, held on file, available for comparison whenever a comparison becomes possible. New databases are built over time. Familial DNA analysis, which compares a stored profile not against a direct match, but against close biological relatives who may be in a database, has been used to identify individuals in cases older than this one. That methodology has not, as of the available record, been publicly confirmed as applied to the Zodiac profile in any formal law enforcement context, though whether it has been explored informally or by individual agencies without public announcement is not something the available record addresses. What the record shows is what it shows: a profile on file, a series of negative comparisons, a case still formally open. Somewhere in that same archive, alongside the DNA comparative documents and the fingerprint cards and the evidence bags from multiple crime scenes, are the cipher keys, or the absence of cipher keys, for the letters the Zodiac sent that have not been solved. 3 of the 4 ciphers sent by the Zodiac were solved, the last of them publicly confirmed, as decoded in December 2020 by a team of amateur cryptographers who had worked on the problem for years. The fourth cipher, the so-called Z13, remains unbroken. It is 17 characters long. Whether it contains a name, a phrase, a key to other material, or simply a meaningless sequence intended to suggest more depth than it contains, is not known. It remains in the evidence record as it arrived, a sequence of characters whose meaning has not been established, held alongside everything else that the case contains in the same quiet institutional custody that holds all of it. The letters are still there, the DNA profile is still there, the fingerprint cards are still there, the open case file is still there, the cipher that has not been solved is still there. All of these things exist in specific physical or digital forms, maintained in specific institutional locations, available to investigators working with methods and databases that continue to develop. The case has not been abandoned. It has been worked for 55 years across multiple agencies and multiple investigative periods, and it continues to be held as an open matter because the legal threshold for closing it has not been met.